It's been raining for 6 days straight. You're crouched under a rock overhang somewhere in what will eventually be called Scotland, 12,000 years ago, and everything you own, which is not much granted, is damp. Your fire has been reduced to a sad, hissing argument between smoke and water. There's no umbrella, there's no Gore-Tex jacket. There's no group chat where someone says, yeah, it's supposed to clear up by Thursday. There's just you, the rock, and a sky that has apparently decided to personally test whether your species deserves to continue existing. And somehow, your ancestors made it through this. Not once. Not for one bad week. For generations, in some of the wettest, grayest, most relentlessly soggy environments on Earth. Which raises a genuinely underrated question. How did people with no waterproof fabric, no central heating, and no concept of a forecast survive weather systems that dumped rain on them for weeks or months at a time? The short answer is barely. And with an enormous amount of cleverness we don't give them nearly enough credit for. The long answer involves fungus, peat bogs, animal fat, and a surprisingly aggressive approach to interior design. Let's get into it. First, we need to kill a myth. A lot of people picture prehistoric humans mostly dealing with cold, ice ages, mammoths, all that. And sure, cold was a huge factor. But cold and wet together is a completely different, much more dangerous problem. Dry cold is survivable if you're insulated. Wet cold kills. Water conducts heat away from the body roughly 25 times faster than air. So the moment your insulation gets soaked, you're not protected anymore. You're actively refrigerating yourself. Hypothermia doesn't require freezing temperatures. It can happen at 10 degrees if you're wet and windy for long enough. Which means for populations living in places like Ice Age Britain, coastal Scandinavia, or the monsoon belt of South and Southeast Asia, staying dry wasn't a comfort issue. It was the difference between living and not. So the first and most obvious question is, what did they actually wear? We know from the archaeological record, bone needles dating back around 50,000 years, found everywhere from Siberia to Africa, that humans were sewing fitted garments long before recorded history. But fitted animal hide, on its own, is not great in sustained rain. Untreated hide gets waterlogged, gets heavy, and eventually rots. So people figured out something called hide tanning, and more specifically, oil and fat dressing. Animal fats, fish oils, even brain matter. Yes, brain tanning is a real and remarkably effective technique still used by some traditional communities today, were worked into hides to make them water-resistant. The fat fills the microscopic gaps in the fiber structure and repels water instead of absorbing it. It's not a raincoat. It's better described as the world's first waterproofing spray, and it was being applied by hand, one hide at a time, thousands of years before anyone had a word for waterproof. Here's where it gets stranger, though. In parts of Northern Europe, particularly the British Isles and Scandinavia, archaeologists have found something that looks almost too clever for the period: birch bark processing. Birch bark contains a compound called betulin, which is naturally water-resistant, antimicrobial, and incredibly durable. People peeled it, softened it, and used it for containers, roofing, and even footwear linings. There's evidence of birch bark tar, a sticky, waterproof adhesive made by essentially cooking bark in a sealed, low-oxygen environment, being used as far back as 200,000 years ago by Neanderthals. Let that sit for a second. Neanderthals were running controlled pyrolysis, a genuinely technical chemical process to make waterproofing glue in an ice age without writing anything down. If someone described that process to you cold, you'd assume it belonged to a much later, much more civilized era. It doesn't. It belongs to a species we still like to draw as a slouching brute with a club. Now let's talk about shelter, because staying dry outdoors is only half the battle. The other half is having somewhere to go when the rain doesn't stop. And this is where a lot of assumptions about prehistoric life fall apart. We tend to picture early humans as constantly exposed, huddled in the open. In reality, in genuinely wet climates, shelter construction was aggressive, deliberate, and often surprisingly sophisticated. In parts of Ice Age Europe, archaeologists have found the remains of structures built almost entirely from mammoth bones, ribs and tusks used as a frame, likely covered with hides, dating back over 15,000 years at sites in what's now Ukraine. Why mammoth bone instead of wood? Because in the open, treeless steppe environments where a lot of these sites are located, wood was scarce, but dead mammoths, unfortunately for the mammoths, were not. These structures weren't casual lean-tos. Some show evidence of repeated, long-term use. Packed floors, hearths, organized activity zones. This is architecture. Rain-resistant, wind-resistant architecture built from the largest available building material on the landscape. In wetter, more forested regions, the strategy shifted towards something you might not expect: going underground, or at least half underground. Pit houses, dwellings dug partially into the earth with a low roof structure built over the top, show up across multiple cultures independently. From parts of Ice Age Europe to later Native American sites in the Pacific Northwest, one of the rainiest environments in North America. The logic is straightforward once you think about it. The Earth itself is an excellent insulator, and a sunken floor means wind and driving rain pass over the structure rather than directly into it. Some of these structures had roofs made of layered turf, essentially prehistoric green roofs, which absorb and slow water runoff instead of letting it pour straight through. Modern sustainable architecture has, somewhat sheepishly, started reinventing this exact idea in the last 20 years and calling it innovative. Fire deserves its own moment here, because keeping a fire alive through weeks of rain is arguably one of the most underrated survival skills in human history. You cannot simply throw wet wood on a flame and hope for the best. Communities living in consistently wet environments developed real fire management systems. Drying racks built specifically to season wood ahead of need, the deliberate harvesting of fat wood, resin-saturated pine that ignites even when damp because the resin itself is flammable, and fire carrying. The practice of keeping a slow ember alive inside a protected container, sometimes for days, so a fire never had to be started completely from scratch in the middle of a downpour. Losing your only fire during a multi-week rain event wasn't an inconvenience. In a cold, wet climate, it could be a death sentence within days. So fire wasn't just made, it was managed, protected, and passed down like a living resource because, in a very real sense, it was won. There's also the food problem, which rain makes considerably worse. Sustained wet weather crushes hunting efficiency. Animals hide, tracks wash away, and your own scent carries differently in humid air. So wet climate societies leaned hard into preservation and storage strategies that didn't depend on the weather cooperating. This is where peat bogs come in, and this is genuinely one of the more underrated pieces of ancient technology. Peat bogs are cold, acidic, oxygen-poor environments, and those conditions are almost perfect for preserving organic material. Archaeologists have found bog butter, literally butter, deliberately buried in bogs, in Ireland and Scotland, some samples over 1,000 years old, and still chemically identifiable as dairy fat. People weren't accidentally losing butter in swamp. They were using bogs as refrigerators, a naturally occurring cold storage system that worked precisely because the environment was so wet and miserable for everything else. Smoking and drying meat over slow, controlled fires served the same purpose from a different angle. Pull the moisture out of food before the environment pulls the moisture into everything else. A dried, smoked strip of meat can last for months in conditions that would rot fresh meat in under a day. In a place where fresh hunting might be unreliable for weeks at a time, that's not a snack. That's an insurance policy. Here's the part of this story that rarely gets told, though, and it's the part that actually matters most. None of this worked as an individual effort. Surviving endless rain wasn't a solo skill, like building a good fire once. It was a cooperative, generational knowledge system. Knowing exactly which tree bark waterproofed best, which fat rendered into the most effective hide dressing, how deep to dig a pit house in this particular soil, how long to smoke this particular cut of meat, none of that was reinvented by every person, every generation, from scratch. It was observed, taught, corrected, and passed down, over and over, by people who had no written language to store it in. The knowledge lived entirely in bodies, in hands, in memory, in kids watching an adult work a hide for the 1,000th time until they could do it themselves. A culture that survives a genuinely brutal wet climate for thousands of years isn't lucky. It's running an extraordinarily refined, quietly invisible information system, and losing an elder in that world didn't just mean losing a person, it meant losing a library. So the honest answer to how ancient humans survived endless rain isn't one clever trick. It's dozens of small compounding technologies working together. Fat-dressed hides, birch bark glue, bone frame shelters, turf roofs, managed fire, bog storage, built up over tens of thousands of years by people paying obsessively close attention to a hostile environment and refusing to just accept being cold and wet as a permanent condition. Next time you're annoyed that your phone forecast was wrong and you got stuck in the rain without an umbrella, remember that somewhere behind you, going back tens of thousands of years, is an unbroken chain of people who solved this exact problem with mammoth ribs, tree bark, and rendered fat. and did it well enough that eventually one of their descendants was born. Grew up, invented Gore-Tex, and forgot how hard the original version actually was.